Hi, today I'm going to go over quickly some methods for studying animal behavior. I might fly through some of these slides, but spend some time on others that I think are a little bit harder. The first thing we'll remember is that we're going to be trying to study Tim Burton's 4 questions. What's the mechanism that causes the behavior? How does the behavior develop? What's the function of the behavior? And how did the behavior evolve? The first 2 are proximal questions. The second 2 are functional, or your book says ultimate questions, right? The longer distance ones. And to study any of these, we can use the basic methods, which are observational, looking at behaviors without manipulation, experimental, manipulating one or more variables. That's the only way we can do anything, or we can say anything about causation. And the third, which is only available to animal scientists really, is comparative. And that is, we look at different species to try and figure out the evolutionary pattern of behavioral traits. So when we're researching adaptiveness, we're basically going to take those 3, observational, comparative, and experimental, but we also might be monitoring selection in the field over time, documenting changes in the frequency of behaviors. This is what Darwin did in the Galapagos Islands. Or even we could put all of the variables into mathematical models and take a look at how different variables change populations, speeding up generational change over time. We can't take into account all potential variations with mathematical models, but we can do a lot. So one thing the comparative method allows us to do is really see some adaptive changes that maybe don't even really seem to make sense. So there are these fish called swordtail fish, and the males of some species of swordtail have this long tail fin extension called swords, but males in other species might not. And what's interesting, when they look at it and when they've manipulated this, females prefer males with swords even in species that don't have swords. So this suggests that the adaptation of sword preference came before the swords themselves. Now that doesn't seem to make any sense, but this is how it works. You take a look at phylogenetic trees and you see which traits fall in which areas. And in some cases, you'll be able to see that an adaptation seems to have occurred maybe in the tree on the left, for example. Maybe you have 1 or 2 of these sprinkled in the C area that don't. So the C is the sword, and maybe some of them don't have swords. But you'll see that the vast majority of them have swords, so that suggests that that preference happened first. There are limitations to the comparative approach. You have to apply it carefully. You have to rule out all other alternatives. And it doesn't say anything about causation, as we've said, but we can take a look at some questions, even if that correlation might not answer the question. So in this case, we have weaver birds who make these crazy nests, and there are species in the forest that eat insects and forage alone, and there are species in the savanna that eat seeds and feed in flocks. So the question is, does diet cause the flocking, or does flocking protect birds? And the correlation won't answer that question. We would have to go and manipulate that in order to figure out which of those might have come first. But the lack of pattern might actually be important. So one hypothesis for why birds roost in groups is because of thermoregulation, suggesting that birds might huddle together to keep warm. But when they did a phylogenetic reconstruction, it didn't fit the pattern, suggesting that that's probably not what it is. You have to be careful of confounding variables, age and body size, for example. You might think in red deer stags that antler size is correlated with age and body size, but you might think that antler size gives them better reproductive success, and it is correlated. But antler size is correlated with both age and body size, and when you control for age, there's no association between antler length and reproductive success. So it's not about the antlers, it's about the age. Monitoring selection in the field can be really hard. Comparative analyses can trace the patterns of evolution back, though. So that's what, as I said, that's what Darwin did. Beak size and shape in Darwin's finches changed in response to the environment, and he could keep track of all of that. And particularly, we are going to be looking at how that affects behavior. And Darwin did apply his evolutionary theory to behavior in 2 of his books, but he did overinterpret, and it was quite anthropomorphic, suggesting that he was imbuing human behaviors onto animals without evidence. So he would say dogs express pleasure, shame, and love. George Romanes was even worse about this, that he actually had this list of animals and the emotions that they had, with this increasing amount of different kinds of emotions for higher, quote unquote, higher animals. Please remember that actually attempting to arrange animals on any sort of progression like this is not going to be successful. Animals evolve into tree-shaped bushes. They evolve outward rather than upward. There are 2 basic styles of studying animals. One was located mainly in Europe, and that was ethology, and comparative psychology, which was centered in the United States. Ethology looked at evolution and function of behavior, looking at innate behaviors mostly with birds, fish, and insects, whereas comparative psychology really only looked at one animal because they were looking at learning with a behavioristic bent, and they believed that all species learned the same and potentially behaved the same. So they could study one species and generalize that out to all different species. Classical ethology was headed basically by 3 scientists, Konrad Lorenz, Nico Tinbergen, and Karl von Frisch, and they shared the Nobel Prize in 1973 for their work. And again, they focused on inherited behavior, but they also tended to work in the field. So here's an example of what ethologists might do. They compared closely related species. So the comparative method was very much what they preferred. Konrad Lorenz basically said, to know why an organism looks and acts as it does, one must resort to the comparative method. It's the only way you can do this. For example, to understand why male flies of the species Hilaris sartor spin an elaborate silken balloon to present to a female before mating. So what actually happens here is the male spins this balloon. There's nothing inside it. He presents it to the female, and then they go off and mate while the female holds onto the balloon. This doesn't seem to make that much sense until you know a couple of things. The first thing to know is that the female epinid is carnivorous. They eat males if they're approached at the wrong time. So, without a comparison of behavior, let me back up. So if the male approaches in the wrong way, he will get eaten. So now he has to pass on his genes somehow. He has to figure out how to turn that predatory behavior off in the females. If you look across all of the empanid flies, you actually can see steps in the progression that leads to this balloon display, and it makes so much more sense. So, for example, the E. tigrum approaches the female while she's eating. So she's already eating. Her predatory behaviors are turned off, so he can mate with her while she's eating. In the Popliteae, the male captures prey and gives it to the female. So now he's affecting her predatory behavior by turning it off, by giving her something else to eat. The Quattrovittata gift wrap the meal in a silky cocoon because that takes her longer to open it. The Thoracia, whatever that is, gives an elaborate cocoon that contains food, but it doesn't have much food in it. So it's basically like a really big present with almost nothing inside. In the Mara, only some males place food inside, others put something meaningless like a daisy petal inside. And finally, the Sartor gives the empty gauze case. It still turns off the predatory behavior of the female. It still distracts her so that she's paying attention to this balloon. And you can see then how that evolved into this particular behavior. Ethologists also tend to work in the field, as we mentioned, displaying behaviors in the natural setting. They are uninterested. If you take all of the other confounding variables out, they believe that you end up with empty behavior. So one finding that they had was the fixed action pattern, or the FAP, and this is that displays of different species are often exceptionally constant The patterns of movement are as reliable as morphological characters in defining a particular group. If you see a specific set of behaviors, you know what species that belongs to. These are stereotyped patterns of behavior, and they can be turned on, but they're very hard to turn off. So, for example, gray-legged geese have fixed action patterns. If you have an egg that has rolled outside of a nest, she will waddle over the top of it, push it back with her beak, waddle backwards, push it back with her beak, until it's back in the nest. She'll do this with her eggs, but she'll also do this with egg-shaped rocks or random other things that scientists will put outside her nest. Even if she has all of her eggs that she's actually laid inside the nest, if you put an egg-shaped rock outside of her nest, it will still trigger this behavior. In addition, if she starts the behavior and you take the egg away from her in the middle of the behavior, she will complete the behavior all the way, even while she doesn't have an egg anymore. So FAPs continue to completion, and they can be triggered by appropriate circumstances or inappropriate circumstances. Here's a bird feeding a fish, for example, because the feeding behavior is being triggered by that open mouth of the fish. A little bit later, George Barlow suggested that most patterns of behaviors are not as stereotypical as those suggested by the FAP. He suggested the term modal action pattern for these. This is an example of a squid who will change their burying behavior depending on the kind of substrate that they're in, so that the pattern itself is a bit more flexible than the FAP would suggest. Things to remember about the FAPs is that there are specific triggers, and these are triggered biologically, internally. They are innate. So the stimulus that triggers the behavior is called a sign stimulus, but that sign stimulus can actually be social. If you have a member of the species that releases the behavior, it's called a social releaser. And so that's really important for communication among animals. The sign stimuli are really specific sometimes. So, for example, a male robin will attack another male robin that enters its territory, but he'll also attack a tuft of red feathers because that is what the sign stimuli actually is. It's not the male robin itself, it's that tuft of red feathers that triggers the behavior. This can lead to a chain of reactions where individuals are triggering each other's FAPs back and forth, back and forth. I'm going to put up this link to the stickleback behaviors, and you can watch it online. But just remember, this chain of reactions doesn't have to be completely rigid. There are some deviations, and you can wrap back around where part of this is basically a mating chain, that if it fails at some point, they can start again or wrap back around to a different area until they complete the behaviors correctly.